suspended and I be recognized to speak as if in morning business.
The senator from Arizona, without objection.
Mr. President, last week, AOL Defense published an interview with Vice Admiral David J. Vinlett, who heads up the F-35 Lightning II Joint Strike Fighter program for the Department of Defense. In this interview, Admiral Vinlett candidly offered his concerns about where the Joint Strike Fighter program stands today. His professional judgment, while welcome in its forthrightness, is deeply troubling. His concerns, which I share, are what bring me to the floor this morning. I'd like to introduce for the record a copy of Admiral Vinlett's remarks contained in the AOL Defense article entitled JSF's Build and Test was, quote, miscalculation. Admiral Vinlett says production must slow. I'd like to briefly summarize the history of the Joint Strike Fighter program that has taken us where we are today. In a nutshell, the Joint Strike Fighter program has been both a scandal and a tragedy. The JSF program has been in the development phase for 10 years. Over that time, it's been the beneficiary of an estimated $56 billion of taxpayer investment. And yet, after so much time and so great an investment by the taxpayers, we still don't have an aircraft that provides the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps with the combat capability they need. In fact, flight testing sufficient to demonstrate the full mission systems and weapons delivery capability of the F-35 aircraft has not even started. At this point, this most advanced phase of flight testing won't begin any sooner than 2015. Developing and buying these aircraft and building the facilities to support them was originally supposed to cost $233 billion. According to the April 2001 Government Accountability Office report on the Joint Strike Fighter, these costs are now estimated to be closer to $283 billion. Let me repeat. Original cost estimated $233 billion, now estimated to be $383 billion, an increase of some $150 billion of the taxpayers' money. This increase in total development and acquisition costs will only get worse when the Department announces a new baseline cost estimate, which resulted from a second restructuring of the program over the last 2 years. Overall, the schedule for the end of the development phase and the startup of full-rate production has slipped 5 years since the current baseline was set in 2007 and is now planned for 2018. Now, I'd like to point out, during this period of time, the manufacturer, Lockheed Martin, has continued to make record profits. In fact, they just announced their third quarter profits to be $700 million. Here's the manufacturer that was supposed to build an aircraft that was going to cost $233 billion. It's now estimated closer to $383 billion, a $150 billion increase, and we all know now there will be significant cost increases to follow in light of the production manager, Admiral Vinlett's remarks. In 2001, 10 years ago, the Department of Defense told Congress that the Joint Strike Fighter would cost about $69 million per aircraft. But according to the Government Accountability Office report from April, the cost of each F-35 aircraft has now risen to about $133 million per plane, including the cost of research, development, and testing across the entire program. The unit cost of each individual aircraft goes up to $156 million. In inflation-adjusted dollars, that's about double the original 2001 estimate. Unfortunately, we know that the estimate will go up substantially when the Pentagon releases its latest projections, with the cost of restructuring the program factored in and a new cost baseline is established for the program. If these costs of developing and buying the aircraft were not high enough, The Pentagon now estimates that operating and sustaining these new aircraft may cost as much as $1 trillion over their planned service life. I think we have reason to believe that this jaw-dropping number could be artificially high and can be reduced, but keep in mind the rule of thumb is that the cost of developing and buying a major weapons systems tends to be about one-third of its total cost. The other two-thirds are in operating and sustaining it. So with the development and procurement costs of the F-35 already approaching $400 billion, it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect sustainment costs of about $800 billion over the F-35's lifespan. That amounts to about $1.2 trillion investment of taxpayer resources, which makes the F-35 the most expensive weapons program in history. Over the nearly 10-year life so far of the program, Congress has authorized and appropriated funds for 113 of these weapons systems. But as of today, the program has developed 18 aircraft, most of which are being used for flight testing. The first production aircraft intended for training just started to be delivered this summer, 3 years late. In July, the numbers came in on how much these early production model jets will cost compared to original estimates. That was a shocking $1 billion over the original estimate of about $7 billion. Under the cost-plus contracts for these early production aircraft, taxpayers will be on the hook for $771 million to cover their share of this cost overrun for these first 28 aircraft. Let me repeat. Taxpayers of America are now on the hook for $771 million in cost overrun to cover their share for the first 28 aircraft, and Lockheed Martin will absorb the cost of $283 million. Maybe that helps you understand why Lockheed Martin, just in the third quarter of this year, has been able to announce a profit of some $700 million. But this cost for the first 28 is a 15% cost overrun when you total up everybody's share. So for about $8.1 billion, we get 28 aircraft at a cost per aircraft of about $289 million each. Just last week, we learned that the costs associated with the fourth lot of these early production aircraft may be as high as 10% over that contract's $3.46 billion target cost. That's a $350 million overrun with only 40% of the work completed to date. That tells us that the costs of the program have still not been contained, despite 2 years of very concentrated effort by the Pentagon to bring costs under control, knowing that the future of the program hangs in the balance. Now that brings, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for an additional 10 minutes.
Without objection.
This brings us to where we are today in the context of Admiral Van Lett's remarks. The Pentagon has recently completed its analysis of how much the next lot, that's the fifth lot, of early production aircraft, quote, should cost, and is negotiating with Lockheed Martin on who will bear the cost of changes to the design and manufacturing of the aircraft that could result from thousands of hours of flight testing that lie ahead. It is at this exact moment that the excessive overlap between the development and production was originally structured into the program it's called concurrency. It means that you deliver aircraft to the owners, in this case the Air Force, and at the same time continue testing. Something that we warned against over and over and over again as not having worked, but was done in order to have an effort to have some semblance of their schedule being adhered to of delivery of aircraft. Lockheed Martin doesn't want to bear the risk of new discoveries that may require retrofit or redesign of the aircraft. Based on the in-depth studies that the Department has conducted to date, Admiral Van Lett told the publication AOL Defense last week that the Joint Strike Fighter program needs to slow down production and deliveries of the aircraft. He explained that this was necessary to open up the aircraft and install fixes to numerous structural cracks and, quote, hot spots that the program has discovered in the plane over the last year or so. He estimated that the work needed to remedy these cracks could add an additional $3.3 billion to $5 million per aircraft. Now, bear in mind that this revelation comes on top of the fact that the Department has just reduced the latest F-35 purchase that will be Lot 5 by 5 jets. Admiral Vinlett concluded that even as the Pentagon negotiates with Lockheed Martin on this new lot of the aircraft under the terms of a fixed-price contract, there's much, quote, heavy learning that remains in the program. Here's what Admiral Vinlett said. The analyzed hot spots that have arisen in the last 12 months or so in the program have surprised us at the amount of change and at the cost. Most of them are little ones, but when you bundle them all up and package them and look at where they are in the airplane and how hard they are to get at after you buy the jet, the cost burden of that is what sucks the wind out of your lungs. I believe it's wise to sort of temper production for a while until we get some of these heavy years of learning under our belt and get that managed right. And then when we've got most of that known and we've got the management of the change activity better in hand, then we'll be in a better position to ramp up production. Now, Mr. President, 2001 was the year that we decided to build this aircraft. So here we are 11 years later, and the manager of the program says, and then when we've got most of that known and we've got the management of the change activity and better in hand, then we will be in a better position to ramp up production. I am not making this up. So Admiral Vinlett, who oversees the program for the Pentagon, is basically saying that even after the program was restructured 2 years ago by Secretary Gates to add $7.3 billion and 33 more months to development, there's still too much concurrency baked into this program. In other words, the overlap between development and production is still too great to assure taxpayers that they will not have to continue paying for costly redesigns or retrofits due to discoveries made late in production. In that context, ramping up production, even under the program's revised schedule, would not be a move in the right direction, and I absolutely agree. When the head of the most expensive, highest-profile weapons system program in U.S. history effectively says, hold it, we need to slow down how much we are buying, we should all pay close attention. So what does this mean in terms of the pending negotiations for the next production lot? Well, as I said a few days ago, during my opening remarks on the Senate consideration of the fiscal year 2012 National Defense Authorization Act, I strongly support the Department's position. I think Admiral Vinlett's concerns are completely consistent with the view reflected in the Senate Armed Services Committee's markup of the Defense Authorization Bill. As we negotiate to buy more early production jets, at a time when most of the developmental testing of the aircraft has yet to be done, Lockheed Martin must be held increasingly accountable for cost overruns that come as a result of wringing out necessary changes in the design and manufacturing process for this incredibly expensive weapons system. For this reason, the Department must negotiate a fixed-price contract for this next lot of aircraft that requires Lockheed Martin to assume fully cost overruns. And I expect that this contract negotiation will reflect unit costs that are lower than for the last lot purchased, that the contract will ensure shared responsibility for reasonable concurrency cost increases. Put simply, the deal we negotiate on this next production lot must be at least as good, if not better, than the deal we negotiated under the previous one. Otherwise, I can only conclude that we are moving in the wrong direction, and it will only be a matter of time before the American people and the U.S. Congress and our allies lose faith with the F-35 program, which is already the most expensive weapons program in history. One thing is clear. The culprit here is, among other things, excessive concurrency. which is overlap of trying to develop an advanced aircraft at the same time as you buy production model aircraft intended for training and operations. The danger of excessive concurrency is the grand, enormously expensive lesson of the Joint Strike Fighter program, a lesson that we continue to overlook at our peril, trying to execute a strategy for the acquisition of a major weapon system that has too much concurrency based into it under a cost-type contract is absolutely a recipe for disaster. In so many different aspects, the F-35 program truly represents is a tragedy. The Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps desperately need a new aircraft to take the place of the current strike and fighter jets that have been at war for most of the last 10 years. These well-worn legacy aircraft are coming to the end of their service lives, but we are saddled with a program that has little to show for itself after 10 years and $56 billion in taxpayer investment that has produced less than 20 test and operational aircraft, a bill for $750 million, and the promise of considerable, quote, heavy learning yet to go. Admiral Vignelette's message last year clearly conveyed that the path we are on is neither affordable nor sustainable. On that fact, he and I are in total agreement. But that agreement provides very little solace. If things don't improve quickly, taxpayers and the warfighters will insist that all options will be on the table, and they should be. And, Mr. President, I came to the floor today to talk specifically about the F-35 aircraft. I will be coming to the floor again on the whole issue of what is unfortunately a culture of corruption in the Pentagon as far as weapons systems acquisition is concerned. Time after time, the Future Combat System, the F-35, the shipbuilding, the literal combat ship, there is story after story after story of cost overruns, of cancellation, of delays, of incredible cost to the taxpayer. We never should have gotten into it. We simply cannot afford to do it now. We have got to reform the culture of corruption that pervades the Pentagon, and we must reform the way we acquire the weapons and the systems necessary to defend this nation. Now, I'm not saying there aren't success stories. Certainly they are. MRAP is an example of a success story. But when you look at the tens of billions and billions of dollars that have been wasted on research and development, on weapon systems that never got off the ground, when you look at what happened with the Future Combat Systems, the literal combat ship, now the F-35, there must be reform or the taxpayers and citizens of America will lose faith in our ability to defend this nation at a cost that's reasonable in these extremely difficult economic times for all Americans. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Be dispensed with,
Without objection.
and that I be allowed to speak as if in morning business for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, the reason I wanted to speak today is because there's a lot of confusion around something called the payroll tax holiday. It's legislation that's likely to be acted upon by the Congress and perhaps a bill even sent to the President before the end of this year. It's something the President is pushing very strongly to try to achieve, and there are a lot of different versions of it and a lot of confusing ideas about what people support and what they don't. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit here today. First of all, what is it? The payroll tax is the tax that funds Social Security. And it's a tax that's paid on the employee's wages. Half of that is paid by the employee, half of it is paid by the employer. And from the employer's standpoint, or rather from the employee's standpoint, the more you pay in, the more you get out when you retire. The less you pay in, the less you get out. That's what funds Social Security. And so as to the question, why would someone not support a reduction in the payroll tax, or as it's called right now, a temporary payroll tax holiday, because what's being proposed is that a portion of that tax would not be paid. It represents 1/3 of the amount of the tax that an employee would ordinarily be paying is not being paid today. The President would actually like to cut that in to the point that an employee would only pay half of the payroll tax liability. And I understand he's going to revise his proposal and not ask that there be any relief on the employer side. But what the President, therefore, is asking is that half of what an employee pays, or 3.1% of payroll, not be paid for one more year. Now, the first reason that one should think carefully about extending this holiday is that, as I said, this is what funds Social Security. And as an employee, the less you pay in, the less you're going to get out. If you're okay with that, well, then think about the program writ large. Social Security is in big financial trouble. We all know that. And as a result, the more we take out of the Social Security Trust Fund, or the less we put into it would be a better way to put it, then the less money there is to pay benefits for people who are on retirement. Now, what's happening with this particular shortfall is that we're paying for it out of general revenues. In other words, what's happening is that since we borrow 40 cents of every dollar that we spend in this country, we're going to go to someplace like the Chinese, for example, and we're going to borrow out of 40 cents that we want to spend, we're going to borrow out of a dollar, we're going to borrow 40 cents of that, and then we're going to put that money into the Social Security Trust Fund, which is immediately going to be paid to somebody who's on Social Security. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, severalfold. First of all, as we said, the amount of money you put into payroll through the payroll tax into Social Security is what you get back. And if you put less in, you're going to get less back. Secondly, because Social Security is already broke, that means that the United States has to borrow the money to put back into Social Security in order to keep it going. And when you do that, then there is less money in the general revenue to pay for other things. So yes, our general tax revenues and borrowing can make up for that difference in the payroll tax that's not being paid in now. But that means that there is that much amount of money less available for education benefits or agriculture or the Defense Department or whatever else you might be wanting to spend the money on. The fact of the matter is, if you're going to spend the same amount of money as a federal government, and now you're increasing the amount you have to spend on Social Security, there's less to spend on other things. And I find it ironic that our Democratic friends in particular would think that this is a good idea. I ran across something from the AARP back in 2010, and I just wanted to quote from it. This is a press release dated just about exactly a year ago, December 7th, 2010, by Thomas Bethel. And he notes with respect to, and the subject is, what the payroll tax cut means for Social Security. He quotes a Nancy Altman, who's a coordinator for Social Security Works, who, as he says it, describes the worst-case scenario. She thinks this cut could well become permanent. And I'm quoting now from his writing. If that happens, Social Security's long-term shortfall could double over 75 years, she says, and political pressure to downsize the program could mount. That could lead to converting Social Security from a universal insurance program to a welfare program, with the numerous drawbacks of programs for the poor, including low public support. If this scenario unfolds, says Altman, it's goodbye Social Security. So her conclusion, or his conclusion, is there's little doubt that reducing the payroll tax carries a risk. So that's the first reason I think one should be very careful about just deciding that since tax cuts are usually appreciated by people, that therefore this is one that we should extend, even though it's just temporary. And that brings up the second point. It can be argued that this is very bad economic policy. There's no evidence that this temporary tax cut has actually produced any new jobs, which is the whole idea. In fact, our economy has decelerated. In 2010, we had a 2.8% GDP growth. We're now down to just over 1%, and unemployment remains stubbornly high. In fact, I just thought I would quote from a commentary of Ed Gillespie on Fox News Sunday yesterday. He was asked a question by Chris Wallace about the payroll tax, and I'll just quote what he said. He said, first of all, 50,000 of those jobs, meaning the jobs that that have been created now in the economy over the last quarter or last month, 50,000 of those jobs are retail jobs that likely could be temporary for the holiday season. On top of that, for every 2 people who found a new job, 5 people left the workforce entirely, which is part of a continuing pattern. In fact, if the labor force today were the same size it was when President Obama took office, the unemployment rate would be 11%. So shrinking the labor force is not the right way to bring down the unemployment rate. Point is, a lot of people have just stopped looking for jobs, and that's one reason why the unemployment rate actually went down. There are plenty of economists who will tell you that reducing the payroll tax is not a good way to create jobs. And I'm just going to quote from 3 or 4 here. As taxes go, I'm quoting now, the payroll tax is a poor choice if jobs are the objective. Art Laffer, economist, last day of October this year. Economist with Barclays Capital, Troy Davig, says, quote, hiring is a long-term contract and this is a short-term stimulus, meaning the temporary payroll tax holiday. Neil Dutta, an economist with Bank of America Merrill Lynch, says nothing that's likely to get done with regard to payroll tax is going to have a meaningful impact in terms of lowering the unemployment rate and creating jobs. Bruce Bartlett in the New York Times is quoted in August of this year, quote, there's no evidence that the lower payroll tax has done much of anything to stimulate either spending or hiring. Article in the New York Post by Andrew Biggs in January, well, this is some time ago now. Payroll tax holiday is a dubious idea, he said. And finally, Charles Block, who is a real expert on Social Security and an economic research fellow at Stanford Hoover Institution, says, and I quote, taking real tax revenue away from Social Security and issuing debt in its place, the policy now in effect, is the worst of all worlds, both for the program and for cutting and for the budget. So it doesn't stimulate the economy, doesn't produce jobs, and it creates a problem, budgetary problem for Social Security itself. Now, I also believe, the third point here is that it can be bad tax policy. I note from a Wall Street Journal editorial dated December 2nd, here's the beginning of it. So here's the latest Democratic job growth plan, rather. Pay for a temporary tax cut that has already proven not to create jobs with a permanent tax increase that almost certainly will cost jobs. That's the essence of Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid's plan to finance a one-year payroll tax cut with a 3.25% income tax surcharge on upper-income Americans that would last for at least 10 years. I understand now they're thinking about maybe revising that for this exact reason. But that's the point, Mr. President. The surtax is, in reality, a new tax that primarily hits small business owners. That's who creates the jobs. Almost all of the new net jobs created since the 80s are in small businesses. It creates about 70% of the new jobs, most of them coming out of the recessionary time that we're in. And what does Treasury say about the people who would be hit by this surtax? Well, Treasury estimates 392,000 returns have an income over $1 million. And of that, 311,000 are classified as business owners. So about 80% of the people that would get hit by this surtax are the very job creators that we're hoping will invest their money into their businesses to help the economy and create new jobs. How do you create new jobs? By taking more earnings away from the very employers that are creating the jobs. So third, it is bad tax policy. Now, fourth, Democrats argue that, well, the wealthy aren't paying their fair share. And this, too, is something that just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. These are from Internal Revenue Service, their tables. The top earners pay the bulk of the taxes in this country. In fact, we have the most progressive income tax system of all of the industrialized countries, all of the countries in the OECD. The top 1% in our country earn 20% of all the income. That's pretty good. But they pay 38% of all of the income taxes. The top 2% earns just about 28% of the total income. They pay over 48%, almost 50%, almost half of all of the income taxes are paid by the top 2%. Now, some people say, well, what about the payroll tax? But that's exactly what we're cutting here, remember? That's what they're getting a tax holiday from paying. So you've got the top 2% of the people paying 50% of the taxes. What do the bottom half pay? Turns out the Joint Committee on Taxation estimates that 51% of all households had either zero or negative income tax liability for the tax year 2009. So you got 2% of the people paying 50% and the bottom 50% paying none. In fact, the top 5% pay a whole lot more than the bottom 95% combined. Think of that. In our country, the top 5% of the earners pay a lot more than the bottom 95% combined. So the question is then, is it really fair to say about the United States progressive income tax code that the wealthy don't pay their, quote, fair share when the top 1% pays 38%, the top 2% almost half of all taxes? I think that's a canard. I'm not trying to defend rich people here, but what I am saying is it's unfair to say that they're not paying their fair share. Now, finally, my colleague Dick Durbin, who I believe is going to be here shortly, and I hope will respond to what I'm saying here, was interviewed on MSNBC on November 30th, and he had said something that I suspect he would, in retrospect, say is inaccurate and would take back. But I want to quote it. He's talking about the payroll tax holiday, and he said, quote, John Kyle rejected it. He said, no, there's no way we're going to impose any taxes on the wealthy people in this country. End of quote. Well, of course, Senator Durbin knows that we impose a lot of taxes on the wealthy people in this country. He simply misspoke. I understand he simply misspoke. But it is a manifestation of the political dialogue here, of one side accusing the other of favoring the rich over the poor. Can't we ask them just to contribute a little bit more? Well, we're not asking if it's the IRS. We're forcing. And when 2%, the top 2% of our citizens pay half of all the taxes, and the bottom half pay none, when the top 5% pay 95% of all the taxes, and the 95% pay the rest, it's hard to say that the rich are not paying taxes. In any event, my colleague, Senator Durbin, I'm sure would acknowledge that I have not said, nor has anyone said, quote, there's no way we're going to impose any taxes on the wealthy people in this country. They're paying a lot of taxes. Finally, Mr. President, we extended this tax cut holiday for 1 year, a year ago, in December. We did that as part of an overall budget deal. The Vice President of the United States, the leaders of the House and Senate negotiated this, and the President went along with it. And it was part of an overall agreement in which we said we will extend all of the existing tax rates. The so-called Bush tax cuts, that is the rates that have been in effect since 2001 and 2003, we would extend this temporary tax holiday from the payroll tax cut. We would extend all of those. And I supported that. That, frankly, was the right thing to do, to extend all of these existing rates. The country at that point could not have stood an increase in taxes of over $4 trillion, which is what it would have been not to extend the so-called Bush tax cuts. Now, if we can do that again, I'm all for it. I'll support the extension of the payroll tax holiday. I'll support the extension of the payroll tax holiday with other things being done as well. The point is there are times when it just absolutely doesn't make any sense, and there are times when it could make sense. But because of the four other reasons that I pointed out, that this is what pays for Social Security benefits, it's bad economic policy, it's bad tax policy, and certainly the surtax that would fund this is something that would very much hurt small business and job creation. Those are reasons to be very skeptical about continuing this payroll tax holiday, this supposedly temporary tax holiday. And we should therefore only do it under circumstances that, in effect, override these objections, one of which would be to extend all of the taxes that expire at the end of next year, at the end of 2012, and to include this in it. That would be a good idea. It is also a good idea to, quote, pay for, that is, to find an offset for the revenue loss here, because we cannot leave Social Security holding the bag. And when we borrow all of the money from the general, 40 cents of every dollar in general revenue to pay for this lost revenue, obviously that's not a good idea. So if we can find offsets for it, that's another factor in deciding whether to do it or not. And I believe that Republicans will work to find offsets if we, in fact, are going to extend this payroll tax holiday. Clearly, you don't necessarily need to find offsets to pay for any tax or every tax reduction, or keeping current rates where they are, for example, when they otherwise would expire at the end of next year. Some people say, well, that's the Bush tax cuts. That's right. And did revenues to the Treasury go down when the Bush tax rates were reduced in 2001 and 2003? No. Tax revenues, the amount of money coming into the Treasury of the United States, actually increased after the so-called Bush tax cuts. So sometimes, for economic growth reasons, keeping taxes where they are, or even reducing them in some cases, make a lot of sense. In this case, however, because you're having to take it out of the Social Security Trust Fund, you need to replenish that money. You need to pay for it. And that's why we need to have the offsets that I spoke of. So, Mr. President, bottom line is, payroll tax cut holiday can be a little confusing. There are some very important reasons not to do this again. It doesn't produce a good result, and it can produce some bad results. If there are offsetting policies that more than overcome these bad features, then it's something I think a lot of Republicans will look to. And as I said a year ago, I was willing to support the extension of it because we extended the other tax rates as well. If we do that again, obviously it's something that I would be supportive of. So I hope that this helps to clarify the debate when we deal with this subject later on this week, and perhaps even in the final week that we at least hope is the final week that we're here before Christmas. Mr. President, I notice the absence